Where are we? So we're closing with a talk about Merb, keynote about Merb. So I'm going to talk today about sort of what we've learned heading into this and where we go from here, and some other things about making us less embarrassed about being Ruby programmers, hopefully. First, I have to do the obligatory, I work for Engine Yard. Everyone knows about Engine Yard. Engine Yard is awesome. Hooray. If you want to be involved in Merb, you don't have to work for Engine Yard, though. So we have a bunch of core team members who have nothing to do with Engine Yard, and you should, if you're interested in getting to that point, do not be dissuaded. So you hear this a lot, by people who are supposedly programming in Ruby. Right? It is also worth mentioning, this is Alex Payne, it's also worth mentioning that there shouldn't be any doubt in anyone's mind at this point that Ruby itself is slow. It's great that people are hard at work on faster implementations of the language, but right now it's tough. And then you have people who respond to stuff like this. Does this discourage me from Ruby or Rails? Hell no. To me, the elegance of the language completely dominates its flaws. I'll wait for performance and scale issues to be fixed in subsequent releases. Then you have like comments going back and forth in message lists. You also find that Ruby is one of the slowest languages in existence, right? And then people who are trying to defend Ruby say stuff like, a JIT is under development. The VM has a lot of room for performance improvements, and the hardware keeps getting faster. Java was slow for the hardware that existed when it was originally created. You have people like Joel Spolsky saying, I, for one, am scared of Ruby because it's known to be slow. If you become the next MySpace, you'll be buying 5 times as many boxes as the .NET guy down the hall. And then you have the defense. Rails for the majority of web applications is fast enough. I just happen to care more about free developer cycles, and I'm willing to trade the former for the latter. So if you're noticing here, the pattern is that Ruby people say, yes, you're right, it's slow. It's like the slowest thing ever, but I don't care, right? And this is another defense. Would you rather come to the market late on the back of an inferior development environment, ASP.NET, or make it to market first within a superior development environment system and work to alleviate the scalability issues? I.e., Ruby doesn't scale, but who cares, right? It's so embarrassing, right? Oh no. That's where we are. So to summarize, Rails is slow, Ruby's slow, the slowest thing ever, right? And what do we say? We say it's okay because I'm a faster programmer. So that's great. And that's lame. So that's sort of where I was when I was planning this talk. And I figured there obviously are benchmarks out there that prove that Ruby is the slowest thing ever. And people actually go to the programming language shootouts, and it's true that Ruby does Fibonacci really slow. That's actually true. But it turns out that Ruby is written in C, right? Which means a lot of things that you can do that are in Ruby, including modules that you could include to do certain slow things that other people have already written for you, are written in C. So let's see what happens in real life when you start to analyze things. So some guy did a PHP framework comparison thing, and he did a real app. Not a real app, but a simple app. And he basically did a wiki where you have to go in and you have to do some database access or whatever. So he did raw PHP, and he got 331 requests per second. And then he did cake PHP. Obviously cake PHP, because it's written in PHP, has to be super fast. But no, it's 3.6 requests per second. And if you add code acceleration on top of that, because actually if you just install PHP today, every single time you hit a page, it has to parse, compile, and load every single piece of code that's used every time you hit a page. So the regular PHP. So it's not surprised that when you add a framework like Cake PHP, you're down to 3.6 requests per second. Right. So if you add code acceleration, what that does is it compiles the code only once. It still has to load the code on every request, but it only compiles the code once and keeps it in a cache somewhere. And that gets them up to 8 requests per second. And then the same guy, sort of on a lark, at the end, it's like, update, I've decided to test Rails. And Rails got 88 requests per second. So that's Rails. And so the results are, and I actually looked around, and pretty much that's the results of anybody who's ever done PHP analysis. And then usually, we should check how Rails does here. And Rails usually does fine, just fine. In fact, Rails does significantly better than Cake PHP or CodeIgniter or any of these PHP things. Okay? So before we go on to talk about how Merb does, the point is that it's maybe true that a Hello World PHP app is fast, ish. But PHP, which is supposedly the fastest thing in the world, I mean, the oh my God, Ruby is so embarrassing, is in large part because people like DHH have been sort of conceding the ground of PHP, right? Yes, PHP is fast, but it's so irritating to develop with, so Ruby's faster. It turns out that if you do any significant amount of framework code on top of PHP, it's not fast. It's actually really slow. Rails is actually faster than any of these frameworks just at doing regular, this example and anyone else that anybody did, or it's roughly the same as CodeIgniter. There's no like mythical unicorn fast PHP awesomeness that we're giving up by using Ruby, right? So that's Rails, which is actually a pretty big framework. So the next step is to take a look at Merb. So I could have gone crazy here and replicated a real scenario, but I figured a hello world scenario is useful, if only because I'm trying to show here that Ruby is not super slow. So I just want to show that if you go through the stack and possibly call a controller and render a string or a template or something, that you get a reasonable amount of requests per second. Now, obviously, you add additional code on top of this, it gets slower. But Merb is not a tiny piece of code. There's 6,000 lines of Ruby code there, right? So I'm showing something, some hello world. And obviously, hello world in PHP is going to be optimized as well, if all you're doing is echo hello world. So here's the results in Merb. This is a secret feature that needs to have a public API, but Merb actually lets you return a rack response from the router. So if you have a defer block, you just return a rack response. And we got like 3,500 requests per second or something like that. And then if we do a string render, we're down to the more normal benchmarks that we've reported, which is like 2,000 requests per second. And if we do a template, we're at like 1,500-ish requests per second. So then we did like, on the same machine, Apache, static HTML. They got like 4,000 requests per second. So Apache is a little bit faster than like returning from the router in Ruby. Okay? And then we did like PHP echo, which is actually only a little bit faster than going through a controller, which involves like setting up sessions and cookies and all this stuff, right? So PHP echo hello world is approximately the same speed in Merb as hello world string coming out of a controller. And if you look at a template, in which case I just compared it to a hello world with CodeIgniter, which is supposedly like the fastest PHP framework thing, CodeIgniter is pathetically small. CodeIgniter gets like 300 requests per second or something. So that's 300 requests per second for supposedly like a high-performance PHP framework using a code accelerator in PHP, versus a template, which goes through a lot of Ruby code, getting like 1,500 or something requests per second. Just to back up and say what the Ruby setup is, it's a Merb app. It's a Merb flat app, which shouldn't really have any performance implications. It's easier that way. I used thin and was in production mode and put the logger on error, turned off the mutex. So that's the deal. And if you look at Cake PHP, which is like what people say, it's like sort of similar to Rails or something, it's like under 100 requests per second. If you don't have the code accelerator on, it's like 30 requests per second or something, which is consistent with the other thing we saw earlier with the guy who got, in a real app, like 8 requests per second. So basically, here's what's going on here. We have all been lied to by ourselves, actually. Like the leaders of the Ruby community have ceded the ground of performance because of the fact that Ruby, the programming language, is slow at Fibonacci, right? Ruby is slow at Fibonacci. Therefore, it is obviously the case that Ruby, when you do a web framework, has to be slow, except that PHP has its own problems, namely that it has to load entire frameworks every single time you have a request. Use the CGI model. So that's not fast, right? And Ruby, we've spent a bunch of time optimizing our web servers in C, right? So thin is written in C, so it's fast, right? So a bunch of the, hello? I seem to have lost the connection here. So basically, because we have smart people optimizing common pieces of functionality out, turns out that when you write programs in Ruby, all that malarkey about, you're going to have 5 times as many boxes as the Java guy down the hall. I can't really speak to Java, but there are plenty of, I think Facebook is written in PHP, although I could be totally wrong about that. But I think there's big apps that are written in PHP that obviously are not, we can do better. If you were to write a pure Ruby app, which is actually where Rails started, you actually have a lot of headroom, right? I would personally prefer taking Rack, if I was going to build a MySpace, and building a Ruby app, rather than trying to do something in PHP, which is not fast. That's just not true, right? So while we're on the topic of benchmarks, I said, what about other Ruby things? So again, this is kind of cheating, because returning from the Merb router has no overhead at all. But you could do it. It's possible. And it's roughly equivalent to like what Sinatra does, which is basically just have a router. So if you were to make an app that was just in the router, which is not really what probably we're going to be recommending people do. But if you were to make an app that's just in the router, it would look really similar to a Sinatra app, right? You would say like this URL, defer to, and then you'd be able to return a response in there. And that's really fast. I think we did benchmarks of just pure Rack, and we got like 200 more requests per second. So that's like the fastest way you can make a Ruby application that has that isn't like writing a Rack handler or a Mongrel handler directly. And then a Merb controller, we said was like 200. Sinatra is 2,000. Sinatra's a little bit faster than a Merb controller, but a Merb controller actually does a lot of things. And we were looking at this yesterday. We were like, why is the router so much faster? And there's just you have to set up cookies. You have to sometimes set up a session. Or you have to figure out what controller to route to. There's a whole bunch of work that has to be done to get that working. And actually, it's clearly a place for us to look into optimizing, but it wasn't obvious last night exactly how to do that. But we're talking about 2,000 requests per second versus 3,500, which is far out of the league of Cake PHP's 90 requests per second. So I just want to keep things in perspective here. Right, that's Cake PHP. So. Seriously, like anytime anybody ever says Ruby's slow, make them do this benchmark. And tell them that if they want to write raw PHP, maybe it will be like the same. But if they write using any PHP framework, it's pathetic. It's bad. PHP is not slow. I mean, not fast. So basically, we don't need to be embarrassed. That's the first part of my talk. Okay? We need to stop this business. Okay? We have other issues. We have deployment concerns that are getting resolved by things like Passenger. But we aren't in a situation where Ruby apps are pathetically slow. Can people write really slow Ruby apps? Yes. WordPress gets 8 requests per second. Okay? You can write slow PHP apps too. Am I saying a lot of people don't write slow Ruby apps? No, plenty of people write slow Ruby apps. But if you're writing the next MySpace, hopefully you know how to optimize your Ruby code. Okay? And even if you write your code in Rails, your overhead is significantly less. So that's the story. Stop being embarrassed. It's ridiculous already. Okay. So now that I've talked about the fact that Ruby is not slow, although it is slow at Fibonacci, I will concede that ground. If you're making a Fibonacci web app, use something else. Let's talk about the future, which is Merb 2.0. So first of all, Merb 2.0, I'm going to get a little bit more into this. It's not going to be like, 1.1 is like a slight improvement, and then one day we're like, we have made all millions of changes. Now here's 2.0. It is suddenly a different thing than the last incremental release that we released. We're not going to do that. So I'll talk about exactly what the plan is in a little bit. But first of all, we're going to keep modular. So this is a fairly important moving forward thing about Merb. For all the work that we're putting into making Merb really easy to get up and running with, the core thing about Merb is that it's going to remain modular. It's going to remain something that you could hack on. It's going to remain really easy to take things out and put things in and make your own thing. Okay? But it's going to be integrated. Everybody in the Unix community has already proved that this is possible. So is it hard? Yes, it's hard. Okay? But it's possible. So Merb is not in the business of saying it's too hard. We're in the business of saying if someone else was able to do it, we can do it too. And that's what 2.0 is going to be about. It's going to be about figuring out how to make it so that we can keep really modular things. We can still have PS, in Unix parlance. We can still have really simple tools that do really simple things, but we can put them together to create a really powerful thing like Ubuntu. It's possible, right? If it's possible to do with Unix, it's possible to do with web frameworks. So the first thing we're looking at is Django. I don't remember who talked about Django. Somebody in the audience. But yes, Django is an important part of, looking at Django is an important part of what we're doing going forward. So Django has an administration panel, a bunch of stuff in there. That's really cool. And we are basically going to look at that stuff. We're not going to copy it directly because Django has a funny monolithic pane in it. And actually, I would recommend that anybody who's sort of interested in web frameworks in general watch all the DjangoCon videos that are on YouTube. But there's a bunch of talks in there where people are like, Django is too monolithic. And look at the dependency graph of Django. It's crazy. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to end up in a situation where every module in Merb relies on every other module in Merb, and you can't use the admin panel unless you're using jQuery and data mapper and every other little thing that we decided. Right? That's not the plan. So, but the plan is to create something that out of the box works as simply and pleasantly as Django. So we're going to have something like edit your DB through an auto admin interface. We're going to have slices, have an automatic administration hooks. And we're not exactly sure what the specific plan here is, but the idea is that as we move forward, and presumably people are using a bunch of slices, slices should have a way to register with your application that they have some way of administrating themselves, and that you not have to go into every single slice and figure out how that slice decides it wants to be administered, but that there be a central /admin where you could register, hi, this is how you administer the blog slice. Here's how you administer, right? And there's a way to get to it from a central place, right? In order to do all of this and not require data mapper, we need an ORM interface. We need some way of saying, you don't actually have to know anything about your ORM if you're writing a plugin. You just use the thing that Merb provides. And Merb, every person who wants to have an ORM work with Merb just has to register these methods. So you might have like Merb ORM.find, and it would automatically say, oh, I'm using data mapper, that means I use get. Simple example. It's really easy to do that, really hard to do the full thing, but we need to basically provide an API so that the ORM plugins and future ORMs that want to make themselves accessible to Merb can simply register a Merb ORM interface layer, and then everything will just work, right? And then if we write the admin interface using the ORM layer, and obviously, data mapper will be the first one to have a fully working interface abstraction layer, but Active Record probably won't be far behind. People will be able to use anything, it will just work, right? The idea is that it will be possible to build stacks with Active Record prototype, whatever you want. This is pretty much a crucial part of moving forward with Merb, is that we want it to be possible to take what we've built and duplicate it using whatever other stack you want by simply dropping out data mapper and dropping in Active Record, and then every other piece of the stack doesn't really know anything about that at all. You just have to implement something, right? Another thing that is changing probably in 2.0, and this is something we'd hoped would happen by 1.0, but turned out to be a lower priority perhaps than other people than we would have wanted. It's just that, so it turns out that mailers are one way of sending messages to people, but as we move into the 21st century, people want to send IMs and SMSs and all sorts of things, and really the semantics are very similar, right? It's like, oh, I've done something, now I would like to send an SMS. So what we want to do is provide a generic way of sending messages that would, come with mailer would work using that API, but you would also be able to send other types of messages simply by registering a new messenger type. So that's coming. There was a lot of energy put into trying to figure out what the right API for this was for 1.0, but it didn't really happen, which means that mailer will obviously have to be supported until 2.0. So don't worry about that. But when we release messenger, there'll probably be like a messenger thing you could use instead of mailer. So that's pretty much the story in 2.0. So what's the process? I sort of talked about 2.0 a lot. How are we getting to 2.0? Does that mean in a year we'll just say here's 2.0? So no. 1.0 is basically simply a stake in the ground. It's saying everything that's here today is going to be here tomorrow. It's going to be here until 2.0. All the public interfaces that we expose today will be supported until 2.0. All the 1.x's are backwards compatible, stable experiments. So we release 1.1. 1.1 will work with the entire 1.0 API just fine. Everything will be great. It'll be stable. It'll work. But everything in 1.1 is considered experimental. So that means that when we release 1.2, 1.0 still works, still backwards compatible with 1.0, but we reserve the right to make changes to things we made in the middle. So obviously this doesn't mean we're in the Wild West and we do whatever we want. It means we still say with the 1.2, here's the things that changed from 1.1. But 1.1 is not the same stake in the ground that 1.0 is. The important thing here is that we want to build 2.0 incrementally. We don't want to drop 2.0 down the pike, and here's 2.0, right? We want to be able to say, here's some features that we've added. Play with it. And then people will presumably say those features are no good, or it would be better if you change the API to this, right? And if every time we released 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, we were locked into that API forever, we would be unable to modify it. And we would do what other frameworks do, which is do everything on head forever, right? And every so often we drop a release, but really everything happens on head. We don't want to do that. We want to be able to have releases that come out that you can use, that are considered stable, that are guaranteed backwards compatible with 1.0, but which are an incremental way of getting to 2.0. So this is another important thing about the 1.x releases. When we release 1.0 final, the 1.0 spec suite, the public spec suite, is a spec suite that will be run against all 1.x releases. So when we release 1.0, we don't run the spec suite only of what is there in 1.1. We also go back to the spec suite we released with 1.0 and make sure it still runs. Right? So that means a guarantee that our API is not changing. That's a systematic way of proving that point. We're going to continue supporting 1.0 with 1.0.x. So what I just said about experimental might be a little scary to some people who are building apps for a living. If that scares you, you should use 1.0. You should use 1.0 until 2.0 comes out. We will fix bugs, we'll fix security problems, we'll backport things that are sane to backport that don't change the API of 1.0 until we release 2.0. So we're going to continue to support 1.0. We will not do the same with 1.1. So once 1.2 comes out, with the exception of security patches, only 1.2 is then supported as the current release. So if you get off the 1.0 branch, that means that you're basically agreeing to upgrade every time we release a new .x. But we're going to make sure that that path is easy, that we tell you what public API things have changed, and you're only going to even have a problem with this if you have used some features that were introduced in 1.1. So that's sort of the process here. What does this mean exactly? So the fact that we have a public API here means that that's how this is going to work, first of all. This can't work if we don't have a public API. But it means we need everyone in the community, which is everyone here and everyone watching the webcast, to tell us if it's not working. If you have a problem with the public API, and I think this has been said several times already, it's important that you come tell us something is wrong with the public API. So an example of something that happened recently, not even so recently anymore, is that we used to assume that templates were in files. So if you had a Merb template, it was a file, guaranteed. And someone said, I want to be able to have templates in the database or at the bottom of my files or something. And there's no way to do that. And he said, what I'm doing is I'm monkey patching render. Alias method chain, basically. And we said, that's not cool. What we're going to do instead is we're going to remove the assumption that templates are files, right? It'll still work just fine with files, but we'll allow you to say it's not a file, it's something else, right? And that's the plan. The plan is we like to say we have no assumptions, but there are presumably some assumptions that we don't recognize as assumptions. It seemed like a safe assumption to us that templates were files, right? That seemed like a safe assumption. But it didn't turn out to be as safe as we thought, and instead of someone going off and releasing, he was in the middle of working on a plugin that added the feature via monkey patch. He came to us and he said, I'm having this problem, and we fixed it. The public API didn't change with the exception of adding a new public API, and he was able to move forward without doing something that almost certainly would have broken in the next point release. Okay? The private API will change. That's the trade-off that we're making here. Right? Rails has no private API. Rails has an API, methods in Rails. And you use those. And people monkey patch everything. And that's a lot of power, but it also means that they can't change anything ever without breaking somebody's plugin. So we're telling you there is a public API. Use it. If you write a plugin as a plugin API, use that. If you use the private API, we're really going to change that. It's not going to be like Rails where occasionally we change it. We're actually going to be aggressively making modifications to make things faster, easier, more efficient. Right? We're going to aggressively change things in the private API. That's the plan. We're pretty sure that the entire router is going to change between 1.0 and 2.0 internally. Like it's not going to be the same thing at all. It may not even have the same class names. The public API is going to be exactly the same. Merb router.prepare, right? And anything else that's in the public API. But the private functionality is going to be completely rewritten almost certainly between 1.0 and 2.0. And that's probably the case about the entire rendering system. Okay, so what we've done here is we've been able to release a 1.0 because we've made a deal with you guys, and we're hoping that you accept and follow the deal. Another thing that needs to happen is to keep an eye on slices. So slices right now are a nice, fun piece of functionality, but there's no real central way that they work in Merb. It's very likely that something like what I said with a way of registering slices with an admin page will happen in the future, and that's going to be an additional public API. I would consider it part of 2.0, but it will probably drop much earlier in a .x release. So keep an eye on that if you're developing a slice for reuse. And right now you have to do something hackish to provide, for instance, administration capabilities. Just keep an eye on what we add. Slices, I think one of the major things that came out of this conference is that pretty much everybody understands now that slices are the way that we're going to do reusable code in Merb. And so figuring out a way to make it really easy to combine slices and administrate them is going to be something that we're going to definitely take a look at going forward. So if you're going to make a slice, keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on that. So to summarize, Merb 2.0 is about rapid prototyping. It's about making it much easier than it is today to rapid prototype. But Merb 2.0 is still a hacker's framework. So that is never going to go away. And it would be easy to come out of this conference and say, it looks like Merb is taking the direction of stopping to be a hacker's framework and being more about new developers. And that is not true, because everyone on the core team uses Merb, and we're not interested in stopping development on good features or making it harder for us to hack into the framework at the expense of new developers. So basically it's a trade-off that has been drilled into our minds by Rails, that you have to choose between being easy to use and being easy to hack. That has been said many times by many people, and it's just a trade-off that is not actually true, and that we're going to prove that. I think it's been proven already by the entire Unix community that it's a trade-off that isn't actually necessary. And we're just going to prove it in Merb. I think we've already made great strides at showing that it's definitely not a one-to-one trade-off. So if you are a person, if you feel like it's draining away, the hacker frameworkness is draining away, please alert us to that immediately, because that is not our intent at all. An important thing about basically what this means, right? This is not just talk. Like how is this going to work? Is that opt-out of things should be really granular. So the problem with Rails is that Rails opt-out is not granular. Rails opt-out is I will no longer use active record anymore at all. That's how you opt out of active record. You can't opt out of naming conventions in active record. You can only opt out of active record. And the Merb philosophy is to be like a big Lego city thing where you could easily opt out of any little piece, and not to be like big Duplos where you have to take out. I had a lot of trouble. I wanted to find something like that with Duplos, but I guess people don't make things like that out of Duplos. So anyway, the point is that we don't want to get to the point where it's very hard to opt out of granular pieces of functionality. That's really what we mean when we say it's not going to stop being a hacker's framework, is that you will continue to be able to granularly opt out of pieces of Merb. And if you see that stopping to happen, if we become Django-esque in our dependency graph, please alert us at the first moment that you see it happening, because that's definitely not our intention. I think a really cool thing about the Merb stack is that if you look at the dependencies RB file, which you don't have to look at if you're new, it's just a list of dependencies, like dependency Merb auth, dependency Merb haml, dependency Merb action args. And if you just comment out a line, you have removed that granular feature, right? And if you want to go into Merb auth and change the strategy, you can do that too. You can opt out of the defaults in Merb auth, right? So that's sort of the thing that's unpolished about cache today. That's really polished about auth, is that you can walk into auth and it works. Out of the box, it just works. Everything's fantastic. And if you say, I don't need a user model, I want something else, you just go into another class and you say authentication.userClass equals self, and then it becomes person, right? So that's the goal, is to make it really easy, no matter how advanced or how slick the initial experience is, to just take away just a little piece, to take away a little assumption and make your own thing out of it. So a lot of people have asked, how do I get involved in Merb? So here we came up with a list of things that you should do if you want to get involved. We need this. Has to happen. One of the things that this thing has to do is it has to tell people if people are violating the public API. So actually the community needs to do this. The community needs to punish people who violate the public API. You should not use any plugin that violates the public API because it will not work tomorrow. And if it doesn't work tomorrow, you're going to have pain and you're not going to remember that it's their fault. So that sucks for us, but it also sucks for you, right? We need to develop a community where everybody is building slices and plugins that are extremely rigid, strict towards the public API. That gives us a responsibility of making sure the public API is robust and functional. And I think today it seems so. If it's not, we need to work on that, right? In fact, 5runs and New Relic have both said there's some instrumentation things we would like to be able to do that we can't do today. What we're doing now is monkey patching, and we say, let's add an instrumentation API. And we're going to do that. So don't hesitate for a moment to come to us and say, the API is not working for me. And as a community, make a central slice repository. Maybe we'll get to it as the core team eventually, but I really hope it happens as a community-driven effort first. And make a central part of that telling people if people are violating the public API, if people are doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. Make sure that every slice that does things that will break in the next release has a big red something on it that says, if you use this, it will probably break in the next release. Another thing is work on the wiki. So we've created a new wiki, which is DocuWiki. It's PHP. I bet you it's really slow. You should benchmark that. So DocuWiki, we're using as a wiki. It's cool. It's hierarchical. It's going to be, I think, really fantastic. Something I work on jQuery as well, and something we learned was that you can't beat community-driven documentation. We used to have, in jQuery, we used to have a lot of our documentation inline, and it turned out that the amount of people who wanted to contribute documentation was like orders of magnitude more than the number of people that we felt comfortable giving commit access to. And so telling people just go to the wiki, make the wiki documentation really awesome, turned out to be great. You can go to docs.jquery.com and see really how great that turned out. And I want the Merb community to step up and do similar things. The core team is definitely going to help shape and lead that effort to make sure the wiki is good. But don't hesitate for a moment if you think there's a missing piece of documentation or if the wiki says something wrong to go correct it. The other thing is we're releasing RC1 tonight. It's RC1, right? What's broken about it? Tell us so we can make 1.0 final really awesome. Report any missing documentation in the public API. So I said this like 4 times now. I'll say it again. Seriously, if you ever feel the need to monkey patch, we actually do not ship alias method chain with Merb because we don't want you to use it. I actually have considered several times having a test in Merb core that's like, there is no alias method chain, just to make sure someone doesn't sneak it in. Please don't think that you have to monkey patch. It's perfectly fine. So one of the things I love about Ruby is that you can monkey patch, which means it's really easy to figure out what the missing functionality is. Right? It's really easy for you to make something work today. But what usually happens in Ruby land is that people make it work today and then forget to go back. Right? So I have no problem with monkey patches that are exploratory, that are designed to figure out how to fix the problem. But come to us and say, I had to do this. There was no other way. And I bet you 9 times out of 10 so far, there was another way. You just missed it. Right? So just come to us. Merb is 6,000 lines of code, but it's still 6,000 lines of code. You might have missed something. Come to us, report missing functionality. Ideally, things that are obvious that we missed would be fixed by 1.0 final, which is end of October. The other thing is experiment in general. Right? Slices didn't come out of core. Slices came out originally as a plugin, and slices are now a central way that Merb works. So experiment. If you think there's something that we're doing not perfectly or a completely different idea that we never thought of, play with it and report back. Tell us what works. Right? Say I did this completely. I came up with a good way to do component frameworks. If someone comes up with a good way to do component frameworks in Ruby, please let me know. So far, nobody has been successful. But if we figure it out, I have no problem whatsoever making Merb able to do component-like things. So come back. Tell us what worked. Go to merbunity.com and list your site. By list your site, I mean it's going to work soon, I'm told by Daniel Nyman. So it's going to be very useful for people to report, to say, hey, I use Merb, here's my site, here's what my site's about. Get other people who are interested in Merb to look at your site, basically build a community. And merbunity.com right now, if you don't go to it all the time, you should. It has tutorials, screencasts, news in general. The news that you probably shouldn't be using Edge because we were working on it in the sprint was on merbunity.com. So you should probably go there. And in like a week or two, I'm told, there'll be a way for you to go put your site in there. So I would do that. I wanted to say thank you to everyone who contributed to Merb. I know I'm missing people here, but this is pretty much everyone I could think of that contributed substantially to Merb. I also want to call out 5 Runs and New Relic for having enough faith in Merb to put together products around Merb, and I would encourage people to use those products and encourage vendors who want to build products around Merb to do so, to prove that it's an emerging community that's monetizable. Probably miss people, so if I miss somebody, please tell me so I can put you up here in the future. If I missed anybody that's obvious, I will put you up before I post the slides. How's that? And then I guess any questions I'll take. Also, Ruby is not slow.
Can you just explain the release process quickly?
Can you be more specific?
Yeah, like when we're going to release minor releases and major releases. And
yes.
When now we're going to release 2.0 and stuff like that.
Yes. So actually, probably the scariest thing about what I said about .x releases is it sounds like maybe we'll release experimental .x releases forever, and you'll always be in pain. We're not doing that. We see .0 releases as stakes in the ground. So 2.0 is really just another, here is a lockdown API. We're going to release probably .x releases every, I would say between a month and 2 months, and we're going to release 2.0 next year, like in the summer or something. I'm probably wrong about the exact scope of that, but we're not planning on having years go by where we're releasing .x releases. We're planning on using the .x releases to accelerate our ability to release 2.0. So we have a pretty good plan for what 2.0 is, and we're going to just be releasing incremental versions of that until we are ready to say, here's the new lockdown API, and then we're going to lock it down. If it seems like we didn't get everything we wanted into 2.0, but it's dragging on, we're just going to lock down the API and release 2.0 anyway. Right? We don't want to be in a position where people are feeling like they have to either be on 1.0 forever or they're going to constantly have to have their app break. It's just not going to happen. Other questions?
I remember at one point you have parts, sort of like a component that you can reuse. Whatever happened to that?
Parts is still available. So here's what so parts is basically, Merb has an awesome piece of architecture, which is that abstract controller is the way that the thing that supports like templates and all this stuff that has to do with templates basically without requests and responses. So like the mailer just inherits from that, the controllers inherit from that, and then parts also inherit from that, and it's a really easy way to do components. Turned out that almost everybody who wanted to do components was like 95% of the way there, and then they needed to do a slice anyway. So we need to go back and look at parts and figure out why everyone's getting only 95% of the way there. For the moment, we moved it into plugins. It's still available, it's still plugin. It's still going to be maintained by the core team. I think it's like 50 lines of code or something. So it's not a lot of code. It's really easy to maintain for us. But we need to figure out how to make it useful because pretty much everyone who attempted to use it ended up having to do something else anyway. So if anybody has any thoughts on what we can do to make parts more, parts should be like an 80-20 rule towards slices, right? Like a lot of cases where you might want to use a slice in your own app, parts should work for you. It just didn't seem to happen. So we want parts to be, we're not deprecating parts like Rails deprecated components. We just need to figure out how to make it work. Did that answer your question?